At 67 years old, Arthur Pendleton lost everything he had spent decades building. In a matter of 72 hours, his successful regional freight company collapsed. Banks inexplicably called in his business loans, major clients canceled their shipping contracts simultaneously, and his commercial insurance was abruptly voided. Left with nothing but a beaten-up Ford pickup and a single suitcase holding the remnants of his life, he had nowhere else to turn. Desperate and exhausted, Arthur drove to his son Marcus's pristine McMansion in the affluent Chicago suburb of Naperville, a home Arthur himself had provided the massive down payment for. Standing on the porch at 7 in the evening, the icy Illinois rain soaking through his coat, he begged for a place to stay for just a few days. His daughter-in-law, Chloe, refused to even open the heavy front door. Speaking through the cold glass panels, her perfectly manicured hands resting on her hips, she flatly told him, "We have our own lives to think about." Marcus, his only child, stepped up behind her and nodded in agreement. Looking directly at the father who had given him everything, Marcus coldly suggested he call social services before they both walked away, leaving Arthur alone in the dark as the porch lights clicked off. Shattered by the betrayal, Arthur was forced to sleep in the cramped cab of his freezing truck. By the second night, he was parked under the glaring fluorescent lights of a 24-hour big box store parking lot. As the temperature plummeted into the low 40s, the visceral agony of the cold set in. He sat starving and shivering in his paper-thin jacket, every muscle cramping, terrified that passing security guards would tap on his frosted window and arrest him for trespassing. At 5 in the morning, the crunch of tires on gravel startled him awake as a vehicle pulled up close beside his truck. Expecting the flashing red and blue lights of a police cruiser to finally cast him out, Arthur was stunned to see a pristine, black Rolls-Royce idling in the empty lot. An elegant driver stepped out into the bitter cold, approached the frosty window, and addressed him by his full legal name, delivering a reality-shattering message. "Mr. Arthur Pendleton. Attorney Vance sent me. It is regarding a highly classified, delayed provision in your late wife's will, sir, and time is of the essence." Arthur stared at the man through the frost of his window, his mind slow and sluggish from 2 nights of freezing temperatures and near starvation. He fumbled with the manual lock, his stiff, aching fingers barely able to turn the mechanism. When he finally pushed the heavy door open, the bitter morning air rushed into the cab, but it was the driver's words that truly chilled him. His late wife, Eleanor, had passed away 2 years ago. They had gone through the probate process together, settling her modest affairs and dividing the small life insurance policy she held. There had been no mention of a delayed provision, no whisper of hidden legal documents, and certainly no mention of an attorney Vance. Arthur tried to speak, but his throat was raw, and the words came out as a weak, raspy croak. The driver, observing Arthur's wretched state with a look of profound, quiet sympathy, simply reached out and offered a gloved hand. He introduced himself as Thomas and insisted that Arthur leave his vehicle where it was, assuring him it would be secured and towed to a safe facility within the hour. Arthur hesitated, his eyes darting back to the meager suitcase in the passenger seat, the only tangible proof that he still existed in the world. But the exhaustion was too complete, the cold too absolute. He nodded slowly, allowing Thomas to help him down from the elevated cab of the pickup. The transition from the icy parking lot into the back of the Rolls-Royce was jarring. The interior smelled of rich leather and subtle cologne, the climate control enveloping Arthur in a wave of sudden, euphoric warmth. He sank into the plush seating, feeling the tension drain from his spine, acutely aware of how terribly he smelled. He carried the stench of old sweat, exhaust fumes, and the sour tang of profound failure. Yet Thomas treated him with the deference usually reserved for visiting dignitaries, handing him a thermos of hot, sweetened tea and a thick woolen blanket before quietly closing the door. As the heavy luxury vehicle glided out of the suburban parking lot and merged onto the highway toward the glittering skyline of downtown Chicago, Arthur clutched the thermos with trembling hands. The hot liquid burned its way down his throat, cutting through the frost in his chest. He watched the dawn break over the city, the sky turning a bruised purple, and tried to make sense of the last 72 hours. He had built Pendleton Freight from a single leased rig into a fleet of 40 trucks. He had worked 18-hour days, missed anniversaries, and sacrificed his own health to ensure Marcus would never know the sting of poverty. And when the bottom fell out, when the banks turned vicious and the contracts vanished like smoke, his son had looked him in the eye and shut the door. The memory of Marcus standing behind that glass, his face devoid of anything resembling love or obligation, settled heavy and cold in Arthur's stomach. It hurt more than the freezing truck cab, more than the humiliation of the bankruptcy courts. But beneath the crushing weight of that betrayal, a tiny spark of confusion flared. Why now? Why, in the absolute darkest hour of his life, was a ghost from his past reaching out? Eleanor had been a pragmatic, straightforward woman, a high school English teacher who favored sensible shoes and clipped coupons. She had never known luxury, never desired it. Yet here Arthur was, being chauffeured toward the financial district in a vehicle that cost more than his first home. The Rolls-Royce navigated the early morning traffic with silent grace, eventually pulling into the subterranean garage of a towering glass and steel skyscraper in the Loop. Thomas guided Arthur to a private, wood-paneled elevator that required a secure keycard, ascending silently to the penthouses. When the doors slid open, Arthur stepped onto thick, cream-colored carpeting, feeling entirely out of place in his wrinkled, stained clothing. The receptionist, a poised woman in a sharp suit, did not blink or show a hint of disdain at his appearance. She simply smiled warmly, offered her condolences for his recent hardships, and pressed a discreet button on her desk. Within moments, a tall, silver-haired man emerged from the double doors at the end of the hall. He wore a suit that spoke of quiet, immense power, and he moved with deliberate, practiced calm. He extended a hand, his grip firm and steady. He introduced himself as Attorney Vance and ushered Arthur into a massive corner office overlooking the sprawling expanse of Lake Michigan. As Arthur sank into a leather windback chair, Vance closed the heavy oak doors, sealing them in absolute silence. He walked behind his desk, but instead of sitting, he turned to the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the sun reflect off the icy water. When he finally spoke, his voice was grave and measured. He told Arthur that what they were about to discuss would challenge everything he believed about his life, his family, and the woman he had loved for 40 years. Vance explained that he represented a highly specialized, private trust, and that he was there to execute the final, absolute will of Eleanor Pendleton, a woman who had kept a secret so massive it was about to rewrite reality. Arthur sat perfectly still in the leather wingback chair, his mind struggling to anchor itself in the surreal opulence of the penthouse office. The thick glass of the floor-to-ceiling windows muted the howling Chicago wind into a distant whisper, creating a profound silence that felt entirely foreign after 2 nights on the freezing streets. He looked down at his trembling hands, noticing the grime embedded in his calluses and the frayed edges of his coat, feeling a deep wave of shame at bringing such wretchedness into a place of immaculate power. Yet Attorney Vance did not look at him with pity or disgust. The silver-haired lawyer walked over to a polished mahogany sideboard and poured a glass of amber liquid, placing it gently on the table beside Arthur. Vance moved with a quiet reverence, treating the broken freight boss not like a vagrant who had just been scooped out of a parking lot, but like a grieving king returning to his throne. When Vance finally took his seat behind the massive desk, he folded his hands and began to dismantle the history Arthur thought he knew. He spoke of Eleanor, The woman Arthur had loved for 40 years, the pragmatic high school English teacher who clipped grocery coupons and mended torn shirts rather than buying new ones. Vance revealed that Eleanor Pendleton was born into one of the oldest, most quietly affluent families in New England, possessing a lineage of generational wealth that most people could not even comprehend. Arthur listened in stunned silence as the lawyer explained how a young Eleanor had walked away from her family trust in her early 20s, terrified of the entitlement and greed that had poisoned her siblings. She had moved to the Midwest to build a life founded on honest labor and genuine affection, deliberately seeking a partner who knew the value of a hard-earned dollar. She found exactly what she was looking for in a young, ambitious freight driver named Arthur. Arthur felt his chest tighten, his breath growing shallow as the sheer weight of the revelation pressed down on him. He remembered the early years of their marriage, the late nights spent at the kitchen table agonizing over heating bills and truck maintenance costs. He remembered Eleanor smiling as she served inexpensive meals, never once complaining about the lack of luxury, never once hinting that she possessed the power to wipe away their financial struggles with a single phone call. The memories flooded his tired brain, threatening to overwhelm him, but Vance leaned forward, his voice softening with genuine respect. The lawyer explained that Eleanor never viewed her silence as a deception. She believed that the struggle was the very foundation of their profound bond, and she watched with immense pride as Arthur built Pendleton Freight from nothing into a regional powerhouse. She loved the life they had built with their own bare hands, and she fiercely protected it from the corrupting influence of unearned millions. But as the years passed and their son Marcus grew older, Eleanor began to notice shadows creeping into the edges of their perfect life. Vance opened the thick leather-bound folder on his desk, the first of many scattered across the polished wood. He explained that 2 years before her passing, Eleanor had quietly re-established contact with her family financial managers. She did not bring the money into her marriage, but she did instruct Vance to create a secondary, highly classified trust. She named it the Guardian Ghost Protocol. It was a fail-safe mechanism, a financial fortress designed to remain entirely dormant unless a specific, catastrophic set of conditions was met. Arthur gripped the armrests of his chair, the leather creaking beneath his white knuckles, as he asked what those conditions were. Vance looked directly into Arthur's eyes, his expression solemn and heavy with the burden of his duty. He explained that the trust was never meant to simply make Arthur wealthy upon her death. Eleanor knew her husband too well. She knew Arthur would never accept millions he had not earned himself. Instead, the Guardian Ghost Protocol was programmed to trigger only if Arthur faced total, unrecoverable financial ruin, or if he was left entirely destitute and abandoned by those he trusted most. The trust was designed to wake up only when Arthur hit rock bottom. Eleanor had foreseen a coming storm, a betrayal so devastating that Arthur would need an arsenal to survive it. She had watched Marcus develop a ravenous appetite for status and luxury, an appetite that Arthur, blinded by a father's unconditional love, had constantly tried to satisfy. Arthur felt a cold sweat break out across his neck as the pieces began to click into painful alignment. The sudden collapse of his company, the vicious speed of the bankruptcy, the cold rejection of his son's glass door, none of it was an accident. His wife had sensed the rot in their own home long before it consumed them. She had gone to her grave knowing that a day might come when her husband would be thrown out into the cold, and she had spent her final months building an empire to catch him when he fell. Vance reached across the desk and picked up a small silver remote control. He told Arthur that hearing the truth from a lawyer was one thing, but Eleanor insisted that if the protocol was ever activated, Arthur needed to hear the reasoning directly from her. The lights in the expansive office dimmed automatically, and a large screen descended seamlessly from the ceiling. Arthur held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs, as the screen flickered to life and the face of his late wife appeared, looking exactly as she had in her final, peaceful days. The screen hummed softly as the digital image stabilized, revealing the face of Eleanor Pendleton sitting in the sunroom of their old house, the very room where she had spent her final months. She was wearing her favorite knitted cardigan, her reading glasses perched casually on top of her head, looking so vibrantly alive that Arthur felt a physical ache radiate through his chest. When she spoke, her voice was clear and warm, cutting through the sterile silence of the penthouse office like a sudden ray of sunlight breaking through a winter canopy. She began by calling him her love, her eyes seeming to look straight through the camera lens and directly into Arthur's shattered heart. She smiled that familiar, comforting smile, explaining that if he was watching this recording, it meant she had passed away and the darkest scenario she had envisioned had unfortunately come to pass. Arthur leaned forward in the heavy leather chair, his breathing shallow, terrified that if he moved or made a sound, the illusion would shatter and she would be gone again. Eleanor took a deep, steadying breath on the screen, her expression shifting from loving warmth to a profound, melancholy seriousness. She spoke of her past, confirming everything Attorney Vance had just revealed about her lineage and the suffocating weight of her family's generational wealth. She described how she had watched millions of dollars tear her siblings apart, turning them into paranoid, greedy strangers who sued each other over trust funds while their parents were barely cold in the ground. She told Arthur that she wanted a real life, a life built alongside a man who knew the value of a calloused hand, someone who built his world stone by stone instead of demanding it be handed to him on a silver platter. She explained that keeping the secret was the hardest thing she had ever done, but watching him build Pendleton Freight from a single leased truck into a regional empire was the greatest pride of her life. She assured him that their struggle, their late-night budgeting, and their shared sacrifices were never a lie, but rather the authentic foundation of a marriage she cherished more than any amount of money. However, as the recording continued, the warmth in Eleanor's voice slowly drained away, replaced by a chilling, sorrowful resolve. She folded her hands in her lap, her gaze dropping for a moment before meeting the camera again with undeniable pain. "We built a beautiful life," she stated, "but we failed to build a strong son." The words struck Arthur like a physical blow, pinning him against the back of his seat. She explained that while Arthur was consumed with the daily operations of the freight company, working endless hours to provide for them, she had been observing Marcus and his new wife, Chloe. She had noticed the sudden explosion in their lifestyle, the pristine Naperville McMansion, the European luxury cars, and the country club memberships that simply did not align with Marcus's mid-level corporate salary. She watched how Chloe sneered at Arthur's blue-collar roots, and how Marcus, eager to please a woman obsessed with status, began to view his father not as a patriarch to be respected, but as an endless resource to be exploited. Eleanor confessed that her maternal instincts had urged her to confront Marcus, to demand answers, but she knew that a mother's confrontation would only drive him deeper into his deceptions. Instead, using the vast resources of her hidden family trust, she quietly hired a team of elite forensic accountants and private investigators. She needed to know the truth no matter how much it hurt, she explained, her voice trembling slightly before hardening into steel. The investigators audited Marcus's finances and, through a series of shell corporations and disguised vendor accounts, traced the money directly back to Pendleton Freight. Eleanor revealed that Marcus had been systematically siphoning funds from Arthur's company for years, exploiting the blind, unconditional trust his father had placed in him. He had convinced Arthur to upgrade the company's billing software, secretly installing backdoors that allowed him to skim thousands of dollars a month without triggering any internal alarms. Arthur sat paralyzed, the heat of sudden, violent betrayal warring with the freezing numbness he had carried from the parking lot. Eleanor's voice continued, acting as a guiding anchor in the storm of his collapsing reality. She explained why she never told him the truth while she was alive. If she had shown him the evidence, she knew Arthur would have marched into his office, demanded an explanation, and tried to fix him. He would have forgiven Marcus because that was his nature, because he was a good and loving father. But Eleanor knew that Marcus was past the point of simple correction, and the investigators had uncovered whispers of a much larger, more destructive plan being orchestrated by Chloe and Marcus to seize complete control of Arthur's assets. She knew that if she warned Arthur, Marcus would simply change tactics, striking when Arthur was vulnerable and unprepared. Therefore, Eleanor designed the Guardian Ghost Protocol. She instructed Vance to let the chips fall where they may, to let Marcus execute whatever treacherous plan he had devised, knowing that Arthur had to witness the full, unfiltered extent of his son's cruelty to truly understand the monster he had become. She whispered that she was incredibly sorry she had to let him fall, so incredibly sorry that he had to experience the coldness of his son's door, but she needed him to hit the absolute bottom so that his blindfold would finally be removed. The video paused for a fraction of a second as she leaned closer to the camera, her face radiating an intense, fierce protectiveness that transcended death itself. She told Arthur that he was no longer a victim, that the money she left behind was his armor, and Attorney Vance was his sword. She commanded him not to let their son destroy what he bled to build, and to teach Marcus what consequences truly mean. The screen faded to a silent, deep black, leaving Arthur sitting in the dim office, the echoes of his wife's final command ringing in the absolute silence, forging his shattered heart into something cold, heavy, and unbreakable. The screen remained pitch black, leaving the expansive penthouse office bathed in the muted, gray light of the Chicago morning. Arthur sat perfectly still, the ghost of his wife's voice echoing in the absolute silence of the room. He felt a profound, heavy numbness settling into his bones, replacing the raw, shivering desperation of the parking lot with something cold and unbreakable. Attorney Vance did not rush him, allowing the grieving father the necessary time to absorb the shattering reality that the woman he loved had spent her final days preparing for his ultimate ruin. When Arthur finally looked up, his eyes were dry and his jaw was set with a stony resolve. He nodded once, a silent command for the lawyer to proceed. Vance reached across the polished mahogany desk and placed his hand on the thickest of the leather-bound dossiers, his expression grave as he prepared to dissect the corpse of Pendleton Freight. Vance opened the heavy cover, revealing hundreds of meticulously organized pages of bank records, internal emails, and corporate espionage trails. He began by addressing the sudden, catastrophic collapse of Arthur's company. For the past 3 weeks, Arthur had tortured himself with guilt, believing he had somehow missed a critical shift in the market or mismanaged his cash flow, blaming his own aging mind for the loss of his 37-year legacy. He had assumed the banks calling in his loans and the sudden voiding of his insurance policies were simply the brutal mechanisms of bad luck and corporate bureaucracy. Vance systematically dismantled that lie. He pushed a stack of printed emails across the desk, explaining that the ruin of Pendleton Freight was not an accident of the market, but rather a highly coordinated, targeted demolition orchestrated from inside Arthur's own family. Arthur leaned forward, his calloused fingers tracing the text on the documents. The first revelation struck at the very heart of his commercial success. For decades, Arthur had built his business on relationships, securing lucrative shipping contracts through trust, reliability, and personal handshakes. Vance revealed that Marcus had used his unrestricted access to the company's servers to download the entirety of Pendleton Freight's confidential client database, including pricing structures, route efficiencies, and private contract renewal dates. Marcus had not simply taken this information. He and Chloe had brokered a clandestine deal with Arthur's largest regional competitor. They sold the lifeblood of the company for a flat fee of $250,000. Arthur read the email chains where his own son negotiated the price of his father's destruction, using the illicit funds to cover the ballooning mortgage on the Naperville estate and the lease payments on Chloe's European sports cars. The sheer mechanics of the betrayal were sickening, but the corporate theft was only the beginning of the sabotage. Arthur asked the lawyer how the competitor's knowledge could have caused his commercial insurance to be canceled overnight, the single event that had triggered the banks to call in his massive operational loans. Vance's face hardened as he opened the next section of the dossier, exposing the depths of Chloe's particular malice. She had used her background in corporate compliance to draft and submit highly detailed, entirely fabricated whistleblower reports to the State Department of Transportation and Arthur's insurance underwriters. The reports alleged severe safety violations, claiming Arthur was forcing drivers to bypass way stations, ignore mandatory rest periods, and operate vehicles with critical brake failures. The accusations were completely baseless, but they were perfectly formatted and submitted anonymously with just enough stolen internal data to trigger an immediate, mandatory suspension of all insurance coverage pending a federal investigation. Without commercial insurance, Pendleton Freight was legally barred from putting a single truck on the highway. With the fleet grounded and the contracts bleeding out to the competitor who already possessed the stolen pricing data, the banks panicked. The loan covenants required active insurance and stable revenue, both of which had vanished in a matter of 72 hours. Vance explained that the financial institutions had no choice but to call in the debts, freezing Arthur's accounts and seizing his assets to mitigate their losses before the bankruptcy courts could step in. Marcus and Chloe had engineered a perfect, inescapable trap. They had watched Arthur work 18-hour days to build a secure future for them, and when they decided they wanted the payout without the wait, they methodically slaughtered the golden goose. Arthur sat back in the leather chair, the full anatomy of his ruin laid bare before him. The confusion and self-doubt that had plagued him while he slept shivering in the cab of his truck evaporated entirely. He realized that the son he had raised, the boy he had taught to throw a baseball and whose scraped knees he had bandaged, was truly gone. In his place stood a greedy, ruthless stranger who viewed his father not as a human being, but as an obstacle to his own vanity. Arthur felt no desire to yell or scream. The betrayal was too absolute for petty rage. Instead, a profound, chilling clarity washed over him. He looked at the vast evidence of his son's treachery and felt the weight of his late wife's mandate settling upon his shoulders. He was ready to execute her justice, but Vance rested his hand on the final, unopened dossier, warning Arthur that the financial destruction of his company was only the prelude to a much darker, far more personal treachery. Vance reached across the expansive mahogany desk and withdrew his hand from the stacks of corporate espionage evidence, letting the silence in the penthouse office stretch into a heavy, suffocating weight. He pulled a final, slender black folder from his leather briefcase, his silver hair catching the muted Chicago sunlight as he looked at Arthur with an expression of profound, guarded sorrow. The lawyer explained in a quiet, measured tone that dismantling a regional freight company was an act of extreme financial greed, but the documents contained within this final dossier represented something far more sinister. It was not merely a theft of assets, it was a calculated assassination of Arthur's personal autonomy. Vance opened the black cover, sliding a perfectly typed stack of legal drafts and medical evaluations across the polished wood. Arthur looked down at the papers, his tired eyes scanning the crisp black ink, expecting to see more forged invoices or stolen client routes. Instead, he saw his own name printed at the top of a psychiatric evaluation form, accompanied by clinical descriptions of a man he did not recognize. The medical documents were staggering in their audacity and meticulous detail. Vance explained that Chloe, utilizing her extensive network of corporate healthcare contacts, had quietly consulted with a highly unethical private physician. Together, they had drafted a comprehensive, completely fabricated medical history for Arthur, meticulously detailing a supposed rapid onset of severe cognitive decline and dementia. Arthur read the clinical notes with a rising sense of horror, seeing his occasional forgetfulness regarding minor administrative tasks twisted into documented episodes of severe disorientation and paranoia. The physician had signed off on preliminary assessments claiming that the stress of the failing freight business had fundamentally shattered Arthur's mental faculties, rendering him entirely incapable of managing his own affairs, his finances, or his basic physical safety. They were building a medical paper trail, a devastating narrative of a broken old man losing his mind, constructed entirely in the shadows while Arthur had been working 18-hour days to save the company they were actively destroying. But the fabricated medical history was only the foundation of the trap. Vance turned the page, revealing the true endgame. It was a fully drafted, ready-to-file legal petition for a permanent, involuntary conservatorship. The document formally requested that Marcus Pendleton be immediately appointed as the sole legal guardian and financial conservator over the person and estate of Arthur Pendleton. The lawyer walked Arthur through the chilling mechanics of the scheme. The corporate sabotage had been designed to bankrupt Arthur with brutal, sudden efficiency, leaving him without a home, without an income, and without the resources to hire competent legal counsel. Marcus and Chloe knew that a destitute, desperate Arthur would eventually have nowhere to turn but to his only son. Once Arthur surrendered his pride and moved into the Naperville estate, they would spring the trap. They planned to use his recent bankruptcy and his complete reliance on them for shelter as undeniable proof before a judge that he could no longer survive independently. Arthur sat frozen, the memory of the freezing rain on the Naperville porch suddenly taking on a terrifying new context. He realized why they had turned him away that night. They had not simply been callous, they had been calculating. He had arrived at their door too soon, still possessing a shred of dignity and a working vehicle. They needed him to hit absolute rock bottom, perhaps waiting until he was hospitalized from exposure in a freezing parking lot, which would provide the ultimate, indisputable medical evidence for their conservatorship hearing. Vance confirmed this dark suspicion, explaining that once the judge signed the order, Arthur would become a legal nonentity. Marcus would gain absolute control over every aspect of Arthur's existence. He would dictate where Arthur lived, what medical treatments he received, and, most importantly, he would gain unrestricted access to Arthur's remaining assets. While the freight company was gone, Arthur still possessed a fully funded, whole life insurance policy worth over $1 million, alongside maximum monthly Social Security benefits. Marcus and Chloe intended to imprison him in his own failing body, siphoning his final resources to fund their lavish lifestyle while he wasted away in whatever cheap facility they eventually dumped him in. The sheer, methodical evil of the plan settled over Arthur, extinguishing the last lingering embers of paternal denial. For 67 years, he had believed that family was an unbreakable bond, that the blood running through his son's veins carried a baseline of loyalty and love. But looking at the cold, legal draft that sought to strip him of his humanity, the fatherly instinct to forgive and protect died a sudden, permanent death. The agonizing grief that had hollowed out his chest over the past 72 hours evaporated, replaced by a profound, terrifying calm. He thought of Eleanor, his pragmatic, brilliant wife, who had seen the creeping darkness in their son and had spent her final, precious months building a fortress to protect her husband from this exact moment. He felt her guardian ghost standing beside him in the quiet penthouse. Arthur looked up from the forged conservatorship papers, his jaw set like carved granite, his eyes entirely devoid of fear or sorrow. He looked at Attorney Vance and, in a voice as cold and steady as the winter wind howling against the glass, asked what weapons Eleanor had left him to burn his son's empire to the ground. Attorney Vance did not smile, but a glint of profound respect flickered in his sharp eyes as he absorbed Arthur's cold, unwavering resolve. He opened the final locked drawer of his massive desk and extracted a heavy leather-bound portfolio bearing the embossed seal of the Guardian Ghost Trust. Vance explained that Eleanor understood perfectly well that true justice required absolute leverage over those who had forgotten the meaning of loyalty. While the trust contained liquid assets exceeding $60 million, Eleanor had instructed the administrative board to weaponize a significant portion of that capital over the past 12 months. Knowing Marcus and Chloe possessed an insatiable appetite for status and public admiration, the trust had quietly approached their private lenders and banking institutions. Through a series of anonymous corporate acquisitions orchestrated by Vance's firm, the trust had successfully purchased the primary mortgage on the Naperville estate, completely absorbing the massive debt the couple had incurred to maintain their wealthy facade. The staggering revelations did not stop at the property line, as Vance slid a series of heavily redacted financial transfers across the polished mahogany, detailing how the trust had also bought out the restrictive leases on Chloe's European sports cars and acquired the master accounts for their maxed-out luxury credit lines. Because Marcus had financed his entire lavish existence on the arrogant assumption of endless future wealth, he had inadvertently placed his own neck in a financial guillotine. Arthur stared at the banking documents, the sheer brilliance of his late wife's strategy echoing in the quiet room like a masterstroke of a chess grandmaster. He was no longer just a wronged father mourning the loss of a freight business. He was the sole, absolute creditor to his son's entire miserable existence. Every brick of the Naperville mansion, every engine block of their cars, and every stitch of their designer clothing now legally belonged to the very man they had callously left to freeze in a big box store parking lot. Vance produced a heavy gold fountain pen and placed it atop the towering stack of legal documents, explaining that activating the protocols required Arthur's formal signature to transfer the executorship and the hostile debt portfolios directly into his name. Arthur did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. His calloused fingers, which had spent decades gripping rigid steering wheels and loading heavy freight, wrapped firmly around the smooth metal of the pen. He began to sign his name, the sharp scratch of the nib against the thick parchment sounding like the striking of a match in the utterly silent office. With every deliberate signature, he systematically dismantled the illusion of Marcus's independence and seized control of the battlefield. He signed away the suffocating grief that had hollowed him out over the past 3 days, replacing it with the cold, immovable weight of absolute authority. When the final document was executed, Vance closed the portfolio with a definitive thud, formally welcoming Arthur Pendleton as the master of the Guardian Ghost Trust. With the legal mechanics firmly settled, Vance pressed a silver button on his intercom, instructing his unseen staff to immediately prepare the executive suite. The lawyer looked at Arthur's soiled, wrinkled clothing and kindly noted that the executor of an empire could no longer look like a broken casualty of the city streets. Vance led him down a quiet, thickly carpeted corridor to a private, lavishly appointed suite featuring a sprawling marble bathroom that rivaled the finest hotels in Chicago. Arthur stepped inside and locked the heavy oak door, slowly peeling away the paper-thin jacket and the stiff, sweat-stained flannel shirt that smelled of exhaust fumes and bitter despair. He stepped into the sprawling glass enclosure and turned the brass handles, letting the scalding hot water cascade over his aching shoulders and shivering bones. He stood there for a very long time, watching the dark, oily grime of the Walmart parking lot swirl down the silver drain, washing away the last lingering traces of the desperate old man who had begged for shelter on his son's porch. When Arthur emerged from the steam-filled bathroom, his skin scrubbed clean and his muscles finally unspooled from their terrified cramping, he found a master tailor waiting quietly in the adjoining dressing room. Vance had spared no expense, summoning a seasoned craftsman who immediately set to work measuring Arthur's broad, working-class frame with practiced efficiency. Within the hour, Arthur was stepping into a bespoke, charcoal gray suit constructed from the finest imported wool, paired with a crisp white shirt and polished leather Oxfords that cost more than his very first delivery truck. The tailor adjusted the sharp cuffs, smoothed the lapels, and silently stepped back, allowing Arthur to approach the full-length mirror standing in the corner of the softly lit room. Arthur stared intently at his reflection, barely recognizing the commanding, formidable figure looking back at him through the glass. The haggard, desperate father with pleading eyes had been completely erased, replaced by a stoic patriarch radiating a quiet, terrifying power that demanded immediate respect. The tailored suit fit his broad shoulders perfectly, acting as a modern suit of armor forged by his late wife's incredible foresight and protective love. He adjusted his cuffs, feeling the unfamiliar but grounding weight of a vintage silver watch Vance had provided from the estate archives. He was no longer a victim of corporate sabotage, nor was he a pathetic liability waiting to be institutionalized by a greedy daughter-in-law. He was the architect of their impending ruin and the absolute master of their fate, fully prepared to return to the suburbs and teach them the devastating cost of betraying their own blood. While Arthur rested in the quiet sanctuary of the executive suite, allowing his exhausted body to finally recover from the freezing torment of the big box store parking lot, Attorney Vance returned to his polished mahogany desk to initiate the next phase of the Guardian Ghost Protocol. The silver-haired lawyer carefully organized the newly signed deeds, the transferred luxury vehicle leases, and the consolidated credit portfolios, arranging the absolute financial dominion of Marcus and Chloe Pendleton into a neat, inescapable snare. Vance possessed a brilliant legal mind, but he also understood the psychological warfare required to truly break people who had built their entire identities on arrogance and stolen wealth. He knew that simply freezing their accounts or serving them with a lawsuit would allow them time to hire defense attorneys and spin a web of desperate lies. Instead, Vance needed to isolate them, strip away their false confidence, and force them to open their own front door to the architect of their impending ruin. Picking up his secure office telephone, Vance dialed the primary number for the Naperville estate, routing the call through a corporate proxy server that displayed the caller identification of an elite, terrifyingly vague financial institution. Across the sprawling Chicago suburbs, inside the pristine walls of the stolen McMansion, Marcus picked up the phone with the casual annoyance of a man who believed he had successfully outsmarted the world. He answered with a brisk, authoritative tone, entirely unaware that the ground beneath his feet had already been completely hollowed out. Vance did not introduce himself as the executor of Eleanor's estate. He spoke with the flat, mechanical coldness of a senior compliance officer, stating that he represented Aegis Financial Holdings, the private corporate entity that had recently acquired the primary mortgage and all associated secondary debts attached to the Naperville property. Marcus scoffed, attempting to use his usual corporate double talk, confidently assuring the caller that their payments were perfectly current and demanding to know why a holding company was contacting them directly. Vance allowed the arrogant son to speak his piece before cutting him off with a chilling, absolute authority that immediately sucked the oxygen out of the room. The lawyer calmly informed Marcus that routine internal audits of the newly acquired debt portfolio had uncovered severe, actionable financial irregularities directly tied to the original loan applications and subsequent wire transfers. Chloe, listening closely in the background, snatched the receiver from her husband, her perfectly manicured facade cracking as she demanded to speak to a regional manager. She threatened to involve their own lawyers, claiming the holding company had no right to harass them over administrative clerical errors. Vance did not raise his voice, nor did he entertain her desperate bluster. He simply read aloud a few highly specific dates and exact dollar amounts, numbers that perfectly corresponded to the illicit transfers Marcus had siphoned from Pendleton Freight to artificially inflate their reported income. The silence on the other end of the line became absolute, thick with sudden, suffocating terror. Vance continued his merciless assault, stating that under the strict covenants of their newly acquired mortgage, these severe discrepancies constituted a material breach of contract and triggered an automatic fraud investigation. He informed the trembling couple that Aegis Financial Holdings required an immediate, mandatory in-person audit of their physical assets and private financial records to determine the full extent of the liability. Marcus scrambled to regain control of the conversation, his voice pitching higher as he nervously suggested they could schedule a meeting at a downtown branch office sometime next month. Vance explicitly denied the request, tightening the noose with surgical precision. He declared that the severity of the financial anomalies left the holding company with no alternative but to conduct the audit inside the Naperville residence itself. The lawyer issued a final, devastating ultimatum. A senior executive auditor would arrive at their home the following evening at exactly 6 o'clock. If Marcus and Chloe refused entry, failed to provide total transparency, or attempted to contact outside legal counsel before the preliminary assessment was complete, Aegis Financial Holdings would instantly accelerate the loan. Vance promised that failure to comply would result in immediate foreclosure proceedings by Monday morning, accompanied by a formal referral to the federal authorities regarding the suspected wire fraud used to secure the property. The click of the disconnecting line echoed like a gavel slamming down on their fragile empire. When Arthur awoke several hours later, the bruised exhaustion had finally faded from his muscles, replaced by the steady, quiet strength of a patriarch ready to reclaim his legacy. He walked back into the main penthouse office, looking every bit the formidable executive in his tailored charcoal suit, his silver watch catching the afternoon light. Vance poured 2 glasses of pristine water and handed one to Arthur, a rare, grim smile touching the corners of the lawyer's mouth. Vance confirmed that the bait had been taken perfectly, describing how Marcus and Chloe had practically choked on their own terror when faced with the sudden threat of losing their pristine suburban castle. They were currently scrambling in a state of absolute panic, frantically trying to organize their stolen lives to appease a faceless corporate auditor, completely oblivious to the biblical storm gathering on their horizon. Arthur finished his water and set the glass down with a definitive clink, checking his watch as he prepared to return to the very porch where he had been left to die, ready to show his son exactly what kind of ghost he had awakened. While Arthur rested in the quiet sanctuary of the executive suite, allowing his exhausted body to finally recover from the freezing torment of the big box store parking lot, Attorney Vance returned to his polished mahogany desk to initiate the next phase of the Guardian Ghost Protocol. The silver-haired lawyer carefully organized the newly signed deeds, the transferred luxury vehicle leases, and the consolidated credit portfolios, arranging the absolute financial dominion of Marcus and Chloe Pendleton into a neat, inescapable snare. Vance possessed a brilliant legal mind, but he also understood the psychological warfare required to truly break people who had built their entire identities on arrogance and stolen wealth. He knew that simply freezing their accounts or serving them with a lawsuit would allow them time to hire defense attorneys and spin a web of desperate lies. Instead, Vance needed to isolate them, strip away their false confidence, and force them to open their own front door to the architect of their impending ruin. Picking up his secure office telephone, Vance dialed the primary number for the Naperville estate, routing the call through a corporate proxy server that displayed the caller identification of an elite, terrifyingly vague financial institution. Across the sprawling Chicago suburbs, inside the pristine walls of the stolen McMansion, Marcus picked up the phone with the casual annoyance of a man who believed he had successfully outsmarted the world. He answered with a brisk, authoritative tone, entirely unaware that the ground beneath his feet had already been completely hollowed out. Vance did not introduce himself as the executor of Eleanor's estate. He spoke with the flat, mechanical coldness of a senior compliance officer, stating that he represented Aegis Financial Holdings, the private corporate entity that had recently acquired the primary mortgage and all associated secondary debts attached to the Naperville property. Marcus scoffed, attempting to use his usual corporate double talk, confidently assuring the caller that their payments were perfectly current and demanding to know why a holding company was contacting them directly. Vance allowed the arrogant son to speak his piece before cutting him off with a chilling, absolute authority that immediately sucked the oxygen out of the room. The lawyer calmly informed Marcus that routine internal audits of the newly acquired debt portfolio had uncovered severe, actionable financial irregularities directly tied to the original loan applications and subsequent wire transfers. Chloe, listening closely in the background, snatched the receiver from her husband, her perfectly manicured facade cracking as she demanded to speak to a regional manager. She threatened to involve their own lawyers, claiming the holding company had no right to harass them over administrative clerical errors. Vance did not raise his voice, nor did he entertain her desperate bluster. He simply read aloud a few highly specific dates and exact dollar amounts, numbers that perfectly corresponded to the illicit transfers Marcus had siphoned from Pendleton Freight to artificially inflate their reported income. The silence on the other end of the line became absolute, thick with sudden, suffocating terror. Vance continued his merciless assault, stating that under the strict covenants of their newly acquired mortgage, these severe discrepancies constituted a material breach of contract and triggered an automatic fraud investigation. He informed the trembling couple that Aegis Financial Holdings required an immediate, mandatory in-person audit of their physical assets and private financial records to determine the full extent of the liability. Marcus scrambled to regain control of the conversation, his voice pitching higher as he nervously suggested they could schedule a meeting at a downtown branch office sometime next month. Vance explicitly denied the request, tightening the noose with surgical precision. He declared that the severity of the financial anomalies left the holding company with no alternative but to conduct the audit inside the Naperville residence itself. The lawyer issued a final, devastating ultimatum. A senior executive auditor would arrive at their home the following evening at exactly 6 o'clock. If Marcus and Chloe refused entry, failed to provide total transparency, or attempted to contact outside legal counsel before the preliminary assessment was complete, Aegis Financial Holdings would instantly accelerate the loan. Vance promised that failure to comply would result in immediate foreclosure proceedings by Monday morning, accompanied by a formal referral to the federal authorities regarding the suspected wire fraud used to secure the property. The click of the disconnecting line echoed like a gavel slamming down on their fragile empire. When Arthur awoke several hours later, the bruised exhaustion had finally faded from his muscles, replaced by the steady, quiet strength of a patriarch ready to reclaim his legacy. He walked back into the main penthouse office, looking every bit the formidable executive in his tailored charcoal suit, his silver watch catching the afternoon light. Vance poured 2 glasses of pristine water and handed one to Arthur, a rare, grim smile touching the corners of the lawyer's mouth. Vance confirmed that the bait had been taken perfectly, describing how Marcus and Chloe had practically choked on their own terror when faced with the sudden threat of losing their pristine suburban castle. They were currently scrambling in a state of absolute panic, frantically trying to organize their stolen lives to appease a faceless corporate auditor, completely oblivious to the biblical storm gathering on their horizon. Arthur finished his water and set the glass down with a definitive clink, checking his watch as he prepared to return to the very porch where he had been left to die, ready to show his son exactly what kind of ghost he had awakened. The heavy tires of the European sports car crunched against the pristine gravel of the Naperville driveway, cutting through the freezing Illinois evening. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was thick with a frantic, suffocating tension as Marcus and Chloe Pendleton aggressively rehearsed their fabricated alibis. Marcus gripped the leather steering wheel with white knuckles, his face flushed with the arrogant indignation of a man who firmly believed his own lies, furiously instructing his wife on exactly how they would manipulate the corporate auditor waiting inside their home. They had spent the entire afternoon shredding incriminatory bank statements and hiding the most obvious signs of their exorbitant spending, fully expecting to easily intimidate some low-level compliance officer from Aegis Financial Holdings. Chloe checked her flawless reflection in the vanity mirror, practicing her most charming, condescending smile, entirely convinced that a few carefully placed threats of legal action and a display of overwhelming suburban wealth would send the corporate drone scurrying back to downtown Chicago. They stepped out into the biting cold, Marcus unlocking the heavy front door with a sharp, impatient twist of his key, thoroughly prepared to dominate the conversation and protect the luxurious empire they had built on stolen foundations. They crossed the marble threshold of the grand foyer, shrugging off their designer winter coats, immediately noticing that the house was oppressively silent. The massive crystal chandelier hanging in the vaulted ceiling had been turned off, leaving the sprawling main floor bathed in the long, heavy shadows of the late evening. Marcus called out with an authoritative bark, demanding that the representative from Aegis Financial make themselves known, his voice echoing slightly against the sterile, perfectly decorated walls. From the sunken living room just beyond the grand staircase, Attorney Vance emerged from the shadows, stepping into the dim light of a single-floor lamp. The silver-haired lawyer wore his immaculate suit like a suit of armor, his expression radiating a cold, absolute authority that instantly brought Marcus up short. Vance did not extend a hand in greeting, nor did he offer a polite corporate pleasantry. He simply clasped his hands behind his back and stated that the primary stakeholder of the holding company was waiting for them in the center of the room, demanding their immediate presence to commence the financial audit. Marcus swallowed hard, a sudden flicker of genuine apprehension piercing his arrogant facade, as he and Chloe stepped down into the sunken living room. They turned their attention toward the expensive imported leather armchair position facing the unlit fireplace, expecting to see a ruthless, calculating hedge fund manager ready to dissect their lives. The figure seated in the chair slowly turned to face them, the faint light catching the sharp lines of a bespoke, $2,000 charcoal suit and the polished gleam of a vintage silver watch. Marcus felt the breath completely vanish from his lungs, his perfectly rehearsed lies dying instantly in his throat. Sitting in the center of their home, flanked by elite legal counsel and projecting a terrifying, immovable power, was the very father they had thrown out into the freezing rain just days ago. Arthur Pendleton did not look like the broken, shivering vagrant who had begged for shelter on their porch. His hair was perfectly groomed, his broad shoulders filled the tailored wool suit with imposing strength, and his eyes held absolutely zero warmth, reflecting only the cold, hard justice of a patriarch returning to execute a devastating sentence. For a long, agonizing moment, the room was suspended in an absolute, suffocating silence. Chloe blinked rapidly, her manicured hands fluttering nervously to her throat as her brain violently rejected the impossible image before her. She attempted to fall back on her cruel, dismissive instincts, her voice shrill and trembling as she demanded to know how Arthur had gotten past their security system, accusing him of breaking into their home to humiliate them in front of the auditor. She completely failed to comprehend the gravity of the scene, blinded by her ingrained belief that Arthur was nothing more than a pathetic, disposable old man. Marcus, however, possessed enough lingering corporate instinct to read the terrifying subtext of the room. He looked from the immaculate silver-haired lawyer standing like a sentinel to the pristine, heavy leather portfolio resting on the coffee table directly in front of his father. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving him a sickening shade of pale as the catastrophic reality began to align in his panicked mind. Arthur remained perfectly still, allowing their confusion and terror to marinate in the quiet room. He did not yell, he did not hurl insults, and he did not demand apologies. He simply reached forward with a steady, calloused hand and opened the thick portfolio, revealing the certified deeds, the transferred vehicle leases, and the consolidated credit portfolios that represented the entirety of their fraudulent existence. Vance stepped forward, his voice ringing with a cold, absolute finality as he formally introduced Arthur not as a grieving father, but as the sole executor of the Guardian Ghost Trust and the absolute owner of Aegis Financial Holdings. The lawyer explicitly confirmed that every brick of the Naperville estate, every engine block in the driveway, and every single cent of their massive personal debt now legally belonged to the man sitting in the armchair. Marcus collapsed heavily onto the edge of the sofa, his knees literally buckling under the weight of the revelation, while Chloe let out a sharp, breathless gasp, finally understanding that the old man they had discarded possessed the absolute power to erase their entire world with a single signature. Arthur remained seated in the expensive leather armchair, his posture radiating a quiet, terrifying calm that completely consumed the sprawling living room. He did not raise his voice to match the frantic, ragged breathing of his daughter-in-law, nor did he hurl the bitter insults that a lesser man might have weaponized after spending 2 nights freezing in a big box store parking lot. Instead, his stoicism acted as a suffocating weight, pressing down on the couple until the sheer magnitude of their impending ruin became undeniable. With a subtle, almost imperceptible nod from Arthur, Attorney Vance stepped forward and began to methodically unpack the heavy leather briefcase he had carried into the house. The silver-haired lawyer laid a series of thick, meticulously organized dossiers across the polished surface of the glass coffee table, arranging the architectural blueprints of Marcus and Chloe's betrayal into a neat, inescapable row. Arthur leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, his piercing gaze locking onto his son's pale, sweating face as he prepared to walk them through the exact anatomy of their crimes. Arthur began with the earliest fractures in their familial foundation, his voice level and devoid of any paternal warmth as he detailed the systematic embezzlement that had bled Pendleton Freight dry. He tapped a calloused index finger against the first dossier, reciting the exact dates and dollar amounts of the illicit transfers Marcus had routed through dummy vendor accounts and encrypted software backdoors. He watched Marcus flinch with every articulated syllable, the young corporate climber realizing that the money he had used to purchase the massive crystal chandelier hanging directly above their heads and the European sports cars parked in the driveway had been tracked down to the absolute penny. Arthur explained how Eleanor, the mother Marcus had always dismissed as overly pragmatic, had secretly hired elite forensic accountants to uncover the rot festering within her own family. The revelation that Eleanor had known about the theft before she died struck Marcus like a physical blow, his shoulders slumping under the agonizing weight of his late mother's silent, posthumous judgment. But the siphoned funds were merely the opening volley in Arthur's surgical prosecution. He shifted his attention to Chloe, who was trembling violently against the armrest of the sofa, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the upholstery as if she were dangling over a precipice. Arthur opened the second dossier, exposing the corporate espionage and the fabricated safety violations that had ultimately annihilated his life's work. He read aloud from printed email chains demonstrating how Marcus had sold confidential shipping routes to rival logistics firms, directly fueling the sudden cancellation of Arthur's most lucrative contracts. He then presented the anonymous whistleblower reports Chloe had submitted to the Department of Transportation and the commercial insurance underwriters, outlining her deliberate, malicious lies regarding non-existent brake failures and bypassed way stations. Chloe opened her mouth, a desperate, high-pitched denial dying on her lips as Vance wordlessly slid a copy of her own digital signature across the glass table. Arthur laid bare the sickening reality that they had intentionally demolished a 37-year legacy in a matter of 72 hours simply to cover the ballooning debt of their fraudulent suburban lifestyle. The room grew oppressively cold as Arthur reached for the final, slender black folder, the very document that had permanently extinguished any lingering trace of his fatherly mercy. He did not rush the delivery, allowing the terrifying silence to stretch until Marcus and Chloe were practically suffocating on their own dread. Arthur opened the cover and revealed the forged psychiatric evaluations and the fully drafted legal petition for involuntary conservatorship. He explained, with a voice as hard and unforgiving as winter ice, that he fully understood why they had refused to open their heavy front door when he came begging for shelter in the freezing rain. He detailed their ultimate endgame, exposing their calculated decision to let him hit absolute rock bottom so they could parade his destitute, broken state before a judge as indisputable proof of severe cognitive decline. They had not merely wanted to steal his company, they had actively conspired to strip away his legal autonomy, intending to imprison him in a cheap care facility while they drained his remaining life insurance and Social Security benefits to fund their vanity. Marcus buried his face in his trembling hands, a pathetic, strangled sob tearing from his throat as the last pillars of his arrogant facade crumbled into dust. Chloe sat entirely paralyzed, tears ruining her immaculate makeup as she stared at the forged medical documents, fully realizing that the blue-collar father she had constantly belittled possessed the absolute power to send her to federal prison for elder abuse and fraud. Arthur leaned back in the leather armchair, observing the absolute devastation of their egos with a heavy, sorrowful detachment. He watched the smug arrogance that had defined their existence evaporate into sheer, unadulterated terror, recognizing that the boy he had raised and the woman he had welcomed into his family were nothing more than greedy strangers. He had successfully prosecuted their moral bankruptcy, laying out the undeniable evidence of their cruelty, and now, he prepared to present the devastating ultimatum that the Guardian Ghost Trust had designed for their ultimate reckoning. The crushing silence in the living room finally broke when Chloe let out a ragged, suffocating gasp that quickly spiraled into hysterical sobbing. The pristine facade she had meticulously maintained for years shattered completely as the terrifying reality of federal prison materialized before her eyes. She slumped forward onto the glass coffee table, her tears smearing the forged psychiatric evaluations that were meant to be her ticket to unearned millions. She began to hyperventilate, her voice pitching into a desperate, shrill wail as she babbled incoherent excuses, frantically trying to distance herself from the legal nightmare spread out beneath her manicured fingernails. She begged Attorney Vance to understand that it was simply a massive misunderstanding, that the medical documents were just preliminary drafts, completely ignoring the undeniable fact that her digital signature anchored every single fraudulent claim. Arthur watched her unravel with a chilling detachment, feeling no sympathy for the woman who had smirked at him through a cold glass door while he stood shivering in the icy rain. He recognized her tears not as genuine remorse for the devastation she had caused, but as the pathetic, terrified reaction of a predator suddenly caught in a snare of her own making. Marcus could no longer maintain his position on the edge of the sofa, his body completely giving way as he slipped down onto the expensive hardwood floor. He fell to his knees in front of the armchair, his expensive designer trousers bunching around his legs as he looked up at the father he had systematically destroyed. The arrogant corporate climber was entirely gone, replaced by a trembling, weeping shell of a man stammering out a desperate stream of pathetic apologies. Marcus reached out with shaking hands, pleading with Arthur to remember their shared history, weaponizing the memory of his childhood in a futile attempt to spark a flicker of paternal mercy. He choked back his tears long enough to blame his treacherous actions on the overwhelming pressure of keeping up appearances, claiming that the suffocating demands of his wealthy social circle and the crushing weight of his ballooning mortgage had driven him to make terrible mistakes. He swore that he never actually intended for Arthur to end up freezing in a parking lot, insisting that the corporate sabotage and the forged conservatorship were simply desperate acts of survival in a ruthless financial world. Arthur listened to the hollow, cowardly excuses pouring from his son's mouth, feeling a profound, heavy sorrow settle deep within his chest. He looked down at the weeping man on the floor, searching the tear-stained face for any lingering trace of the little boy who used to wait by the window for his freight truck to pull into the driveway. He looked for the son he had taught to throw a baseball, the young man whose college tuition he had paid for with endless overtime and calloused hands. But as Arthur stared into Marcus's panicked eyes, he realized with absolute, terrifying clarity that the boy he had loved was truly and permanently gone. In his place knelt a hollow, greedy stranger who viewed love as a weakness and family as a resource to be ruthlessly strip-mined. The apologies Marcus was currently sobbing into the silent room were not born of guilt or a sudden moral awakening. They were simply the desperate negotiations of a thief who had finally been backed into a corner by a vastly superior force. The realization that his only child was fundamentally broken did not ignite a fiery rage within Arthur, nor did it provoke a desire to scream or inflict physical violence. The burning anger that had kept him warm during those freezing nights in a truck cab had completely burned itself out, leaving behind a cold, immovable foundation of stoic resolve. He felt the heavy, quiet presence of his late wife standing beside him in the dim light of the living room, her guardian ghost protocol having successfully stripped away the illusions that had blinded him for so long. Arthur understood now that Eleanor had not orchestrated this elaborate trap simply for the sake of cruel vengeance. She had built this formidable financial fortress to force Arthur to confront the agonizing truth about their son, knowing that true justice required a patriarch willing to execute a catastrophic correction without flinching. He was no longer just a betrayed father mourning the loss of his business. He was the appointed judge and jury over a moral failure that threatened to rot their family legacy from the inside out. Attorney Vance stood silently by the fireplace, his silver hair catching the faint light as he observed the total psychological collapse of the two conspirators. He did not interrupt the weeping, allowing the sheer weight of Arthur's silent judgment to press down on Marcus and Chloe until their desperate excuses completely exhausted themselves. Arthur let the pathetic sobbing echo through the vaulted ceilings of the stolen mansion for several long, agonizing minutes, forcing them to marinate in the absolute ruin of their inflated egos. He watched them slowly realize that their tears held absolutely no currency here, that the old man they had callously discarded was entirely immune to their emotional manipulation. When the frantic pleas finally dwindled into defeated, breathless whimpers, Arthur slowly leaned forward, resting his strong hands on the polished arms of the leather chair. The time for mourning the death of his family was officially over, replaced by the heavy, sorrowful duty of a man preparing to present an ultimatum that would permanently alter the trajectory of their miserable lives. The weeping of Marcus and Chloe eventually subsided into pathetic, ragged gasps, their absolute defeat settling over the sprawling living room like a heavy, suffocating shroud. Arthur did not offer a handkerchief, nor did he offer a single word of paternal comfort to the broken figures kneeling on his expensive hardwood floor. He allowed the oppressive silence to stretch, forcing them to marinate in the toxic consequences of their own boundless greed while the shadows of their stolen McMansion lengthened around them. The crystal chandelier above their heads remained unlit, a stark reminder that the glamorous, artificial life they had built on his stolen labor had been permanently extinguished. When Arthur finally spoke, his voice possessed the deep, resonant timbre of a judge delivering a capital sentence, entirely devoid of the warmth and forgiveness they had exploited for decades. He told them that tears were the currency of children and cowards, and he was no longer interested in hearing their fabricated remorse. Arthur explained that his late wife, Eleanor, had not built this formidable financial fortress merely to humiliate them in their own home. She had designed the guardian ghost protocol to force a profound, unavoidable reckoning, ensuring that the son who had traded his soul for luxury would finally understand the devastating cost of betraying his own blood. There would be no negotiations, no plea bargains, and absolutely no return to the comfortable illusions they had constructed. Attorney Vance stepped forward, his polished leather shoes making no sound against the thick carpets, and placed two distinct, heavy folders on a glass coffee table directly in front of Marcus. Arthur gestured toward the first folder, his eyes locking onto his son's terrified face as he formally introduced the first path laid out by the Guardian Ghost Trust. He called it Option A, describing it not as a punishment, but as the absolute, unfiltered application of the law they had so casually broken. Arthur detailed the contents of the thick binder, explaining that it contained a fully compiled, trial-ready packet of evidence destined straight for the desk of the federal district attorney. It included every forged signature, every traced wire transfer, and every piece of stolen corporate data that Marcus and Chloe had weaponized against Pendleton Freight. Furthermore, it contained the fabricated medical documents and the drafted conservatorship petition, which Vance assured them would immediately elevate their crimes to aggravated elder abuse. If they chose this path, Arthur promised that federal marshals would arrive at the Naperville estate before the end of the week. They would be publicly arrested, paraded out of their pristine neighborhood in handcuffs, and prosecuted to the absolute fullest extent of the law, facing decades behind concrete walls. The vivid, terrifying description of federal prison sent a violent shudder through Chloe's entire body, her perfectly manicured hands flying to her mouth to stifle a fresh wave of hysterical sobs. Arthur did not pause to acknowledge her terror, continuing his merciless prosecution by outlining the secondary financial consequences of Option A. He explained that Aegis Financial Holdings would simultaneously initiate immediate, hostile foreclosure proceedings on a Naperville mansion, seizing the property and liquidating all of their assets to cover the stolen funds. Their luxury European vehicles would be repossessed from the driveway, their credit lines would be permanently severed, and they would be forced into a brutal, highly publicized bankruptcy that would completely obliterate their professional reputations. They would lose their country club memberships, their affluent social circle, and every single material possession they had valued above human decency. Chloe stared at the glass table, her mind reeling as she realized her entire identity was about to be erased, leaving her as nothing more than a convicted felon. Marcus stared at the thick folder, his chest heaving as he vividly imagined the absolute destruction of his carefully curated corporate career, realizing that his father possessed the absolute power to erase him from the world of the wealthy elite with a single, devastating phone call to the authorities. Arthur leaned back in the heavy leather armchair, the vintage silver watch on his wrist catching the dim light as he crossed his arms over his broad chest. He looked down at the two trembling figures, feeling a profound, heavy sorrow that the boy he had raised required the threat of a concrete cell to finally understand the concept of accountability. He informed them that there was a second folder on the table, a second option designed by the mother who had loved Marcus enough to break him before the world could. But Arthur warned them that option B was not a pardon, nor was it a return to their stolen luxuries. It was a path of grueling, absolute restitution that would strip them of their pride and force them to rebuild their character from the absolute bottom. Arthur pulled a heavy silver pocket watch from his tailored vest, its rhythmic ticking instantly amplifying the suffocating tension in the silent living room. He placed the antique timepiece firmly on the glass table next to the dossiers, telling his son and daughter-in-law that they had exactly 5 minutes to choose between total annihilation and a lifetime of brutal servitude. Arthur gestured toward the second, slightly thinner folder resting beside the antique pocket watch, his expression remaining entirely devoid of the paternal sympathy Marcus was so desperately trying to evoke. He explained that this second document was the guardian ghost contract, a legally binding agreement engineered by his late wife to serve not as a pardon for their sickening treachery, but as a grueling, 20-year sentence of absolute financial and moral restitution. Arthur laid out the uncompromising terms with surgical precision, stating that if they chose this path, the Naperville mansion would be immediately listed for sale under the strict supervision of Aegis Financial Holdings, with every single cent of the equity being absorbed by the trust to cover a fraction of the stolen funds. They would be required to completely vacate the sprawling, pristine estate within 14 days and relocate to a modest, 2-bedroom apartment located in a working-class neighborhood, a residence already pre-selected and vetted by attorney Vance's firm. Furthermore, Arthur demanded the immediate surrender of their leased European sports cars, instructing them that they would need to purchase reliable, used vehicles out of their own severely restricted pockets, forcing them to experience the very financial vulnerability they had so cruelly weaponized against him. The financial strangulation detailed in the contract extended far beyond the loss of their physical luxuries, striking directly at the core of their day-to-day existence. Arthur mandated that both Marcus and Chloe must maintain their primary corporate employment while simultaneously taking on secondary, part-time jobs to maximize their earning potential, a brutal echo of the 18-hour shifts Arthur had worked to build the freight company they destroyed. Under the ironclad terms of the agreement, exactly 60% of their combined gross income would be automatically garnished and routed directly into the Guardian Ghost Trust every month until the stolen capital, the lost corporate revenue, and the compounded interest were entirely repaid. They would be forced to live on a rigidly monitored, meager budget, stripping away their country club memberships, their designer clothing accounts, and their expensive dinner reservations, reducing their glamorous, curated lives to a daily, exhausting grind of pure survival. Arthur stared directly into Chloe's tear-streaked face, ensuring she fully comprehended that her era of sneering at blue-collar labor was permanently over, replaced by a relentless schedule of debt repayment that would consume the next 2 decades of her life. However, the most punishing clause of the guardian ghost contract was not the financial ruin, but the inescapable, deeply humiliating moral accountability it required. Arthur leaned forward, the leather chair creaking softly beneath his weight, and informed his son that the money was ultimately secondary to the necessary reconstruction of his shattered character. As a mandatory condition of the agreement, Marcus was required to draft a comprehensive, handwritten letter of reflection on the first day of every single month for the next 20 years. Arthur explicitly forbade typed emails or brief, superficial apologies, demanding instead a deeply considered, visceral account of what Marcus had learned about the devastating consequences of greed, the true meaning of familial loyalty, and the daily reality of honest, backbreaking work. Arthur issued a final, chilling caveat, warning them that if they missed a single financial payment, if they attempted to hide a single dollar of income from Vance's auditors, or if Marcus failed to deliver the handwritten letter, the contract would instantaneously dissolve. The moment they breached the agreement, the protective shield would vanish, and the federal indictments outlined in Auction A would be filed before they even had time to pack a bag. The rhythmic, metallic ticking of the antique silver pocket watch echoed through the vaulted living room, counting down the final seconds of the 5-minute window Arthur had granted them. Marcus and Chloe stared at the dense legal contract resting on the glass coffee table, their minds desperately searching for a hidden loophole, a clever legal maneuver, or a shred of grandfatherly weakness they could exploit. But as they looked from the immaculately prepared documents to the cold, immovable face of Attorney Vance, and finally to the hardened, stoic patriarch sitting before them, they realized with suffocating certainty that they were entirely outmatched and utterly trapped. They had spent years building a fraudulent empire on the assumption that they were the smartest people in the room, only to discover that Eleanor Pendleton had outmaneuvered them from beyond the grave, locking them inside a prison constructed not of iron bars, but of inescapable financial spreadsheets and grueling physical exhaustion. The golden, arrogant life they had stolen was officially dead, and the only alternative to wearing a federal prison jumpsuit was to sign their names to 2 decades of indentured restitution. With only seconds remaining on the silver watch, Marcus let out a long, shuddering breath, his shoulders collapsing in total, unconditional defeat as he reached for the heavy gold fountain pen Vance had provided. His hand trembled violently as he pressed the nib to the thick parchment, the sharp scratch of his signature finalizing the surrender of his entire adult life to the father he had tried to destroy. Chloe signed next, her pristine makeup completely ruined by her hysterical tears, her signature barely legible as she officially signed away her country club status and her European luxury. Arthur did not smile, nor did he offer a congratulatory word of forgiveness as Vance quietly collected the executed contracts and slipped them back into his leather briefcase. Arthur simply picked up the silver pocket watch, returning it to his tailored vest, and stood up from the armchair. He looked down at the 2 strangers weeping on the floor of the dark, silent mansion, feeling the heavy, sorrowful peace of a man who had finally executed his duty, before turning his back on the ruins of their ego and walking out the heavy front door into the freezing, cleansing Chicago night. 6 months had passed since the heavy oak doors of the Naperville mansion closed behind Arthur Pendleton for the very last time, leaving the architects of his brief ruin to navigate the suffocating reality of their new existence. He was far removed from the towering glass skyscrapers of downtown Chicago and the sterile, manicured lawns of the affluent suburbs, having relocated to a secluded, beautifully crafted timber cabin nestled deep within the towering pine forests of Door County, Wisconsin. The sprawling property, purchased entirely outright through the Guardian Ghost Trust, sat on the quiet, frozen edge of Lake Michigan, offering a profound, uninterrupted silence that stood in stark contrast to the chaotic, noisy desperation of his former life. Arthur sat in a worn leather armchair by the massive stone fireplace, listening to the comforting crackle of burning birch wood as the late winter winds howled harmlessly against the thick, insulated glass of the cabin windows. He wore a simple, heavy flannel shirt and sturdy denim jeans, preferring the grounded comfort of his blue-collar roots over the bespoke charcoal suits Vance had provided, surrounded by the peaceful legacy that his late wife had so fiercely protected. The unimaginable wealth Eleanor had bequeathed to him remained securely managed by the elite financial administrators in the city, acting as an impenetrable fortress around his quiet, rustic twilight years, but Arthur found that his daily needs had scarcely changed. His peace did not stem from the $60 million resting in his investment portfolios. It was derived from the quiet, absolute certainty that he had successfully executed his duty as a father, choosing the difficult path of corrective justice over the fleeting satisfaction of total annihilation. While Arthur spent his mornings walking the frosty, wooded trails and his afternoons reading by the fire, Marcus and Chloe were enduring the brutal, exhausting reality of the 20-year contract they had signed in tears. Through Attorney Vance's meticulous monthly audits, Arthur knew that they had sold the McMansion, surrendered their luxury European vehicles, and moved into the cramped, noisy two-bedroom apartment in the working-class district that the trust had mandated. They were currently navigating the punishing, relentless grind of public transportation and secondary, minimum-wage evening jobs, their previous glamorous social lives completely eradicated by the strict, uncompromising garnishment of 60% of their combined wages. The heavy silence of the cabin was gently broken by the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway as a local courier delivered a thick, insulated manila envelope forwarded directly from the downtown offices of Vance and Associates. Arthur walked out onto the wooden porch, his breath pluming in the crisp Wisconsin air, and retrieved the package, knowing immediately by its weight and the familiar, rigid corporate tracking label exactly what it contained. It was the first day of the month, the absolute, non-negotiable deadline established by the restitution contract, meaning the envelope held the sixth consecutive handwritten letter from his son. Arthur carried the package back to the warmth of the fireplace, settling into his armchair and using a heavy brass letter opener to slice through the thick paper, pulling out 3 pages of closely written, blue-ink text. In the first few months, the letters had been stiff, formal, and painfully resentful, reading more like the mandated apologies of a sullen child forced into a corner than the genuine reflections of a reformed man. But as Arthur adjusted his reading glasses and began to scan the first paragraph of the current letter, he immediately noticed a profound, unmistakable shift in the tone, the handwriting itself appearing less hurried and far more deliberate. Marcus wrote not of his grievances or the perceived unfairness of his grueling schedule, but of the bone-deep, agonizing physical exhaustion that now defined his existence, describing what it felt like to finish a corporate shift only to instantly begin a 4-hour manual inventory job at a local warehouse. He detailed the sharp, humiliating sting of encountering former country club acquaintances while riding the city bus in the rain, acknowledging that the shame he felt was entirely manufactured by his own vanity. But the most striking revelation came near the bottom of the second page, where Marcus confessed that for the first time in his entire life, he actually understood the sheer, backbreaking magnitude of the sacrifices Arthur had made to build the freight company. The son admitted that he had previously viewed his father's money as an infinite, magical resource, entirely blind to the decades of lost sleep, the calloused hands, and the quiet, crushing stress that had financed his privileged upbringing. The final page of the letter was devoid of excuses, stripped completely of the corporate double talk and the arrogant justifications that had fueled the systematic betrayal of his family. Marcus wrote that he finally understood why Arthur had not simply sent him to federal prison, recognizing that the 20-year sentence of financial restitution was not an act of vengeance, but a desperate, agonizing attempt to salvage whatever fragments of a soul still remained beneath the greed. He apologized for the freezing night in the big box store parking lot, stating that the image of his father shivering in a truck cab haunted him every single time he unlocked the door to his own cramped, drafty apartment. He closed the letter by stating that he did not expect forgiveness, nor did he feel entitled to a repaired relationship at the end of the 2 decades, but he promised to spend every remaining day attempting to become a man worthy of the Pendleton name. Arthur slowly folded the 3 pages, the crisp sound of the paper seeming incredibly loud in the quiet room, and set the letter down on the small wooden end table beside him. Arthur looked up from the folded letter, his eyes coming to rest on a framed, silver photograph of Eleanor resting on the stone mantel above the crackling fire, her pragmatic, loving smile frozen in time. He felt a profound, overwhelming sense of gratitude for the woman who had possessed the foresight to see the impending storm and the brilliant, terrifying strength to build the guardian ghost protocol. She had understood that true parental love sometimes required breaking a child down to their very foundations, forcing them to navigate the ruins of their own ego so they might eventually rebuild themselves into something genuine. Arthur realized that he had started with absolutely nothing, built a massive regional success, lost it all in a devastating betrayal, and ultimately gained something far more valuable than the $60 million resting in the bank. He had reclaimed his dignity, enforced absolute accountability, and given his only son the hardest, most vital education a man could ever receive. He leaned back in his comfortable chair, watching the flames dance in the hearth, finally finding true, lasting peace in the quiet Wisconsin woods, knowing that justice had been fully, flawlessly served.